So something happened last year, caused a bit of a storm. And what I noticed when the market started warming up again, a lot of my clients were coming to me and saying, Lisa, we need training on business development. Lisa, we need to get more new clients. And I sat there and I was like, absolutely, I can help you with that. We can show you how to use all your systems and the data. You've got to uncover leads that you maybe weren't dealing with. But then something hit me. It's like, well, I know it's bad, but I don't think the entire market's been wiped off the face of the planet. So then I started looking around and realized that actually the account management bit, the aftercare bit was really lacking in recruitment. And I think that's always been a challenge. It's what happens once the candidate is placed, what happens once the client is invoiced. And when we do our discoveries, Adam, we do find that recruiters don't seem to have a handle on what happens after the good stuff. And the data speaks for itself, data. You know, you've got the probability of selling to an existing client is 60 to 70%, whereas it's only 5% if they're brand new. So I kind of been saying to my clients, you might want NBD, new business development, but isn't the reality that you probably need to look at your lapsed or your at-risk clients and just grab them a bit harder, give them a deeper cuddle, make sure that you've got them in your line of sight and you're working them harder. So talk to me about that piece. You know, it's almost like new business development is so yesterday, but looking after existing database is so key. What do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. I've actually done a lot of work over the last 6 months, and we'll make sure we include it in the bottom of this blog, a link to a toolkit that we created for it. I created a methodology which I called hot, warm, cold, all around business development. And what you're talking about started with the hot and the warm. So hot was anybody that you've had a placement with in the last 12 to 18 months, because ultimately they're the relationships that you've already got. You've already got that, you know, on a PSL, or you've got terms signed. You know, you've done that breaking down the door effort. And then it's up to recruiters and organizations to actually think, okay, how can we map around that particular client? So, you know, are you looking at, you know, just one particular sector or one hiring manager within that business that you're working with? Is that hiring manager even giving you all the roles? So can you use automation? Can you use tools to actually understand, okay, what is this whole business doing? Yeah. And also we started speaking to people and surveying them and looking at whether people actually had anything in place to incentivize recruiters for pulling roles for other people within their organization. So a lot of clients speak to us and say, we're working with all of these businesses, but in silo. So our tech team work with their tech team, our finance team work with somebody else's finance team. But what's not happening is, you know, they're working as like a recruitment solution and solution partner. And I think that's two things. Is one is, are people actually being able to step back, look at that holistically and say, okay, right, we've got 30 clients here that we're working with all in bits and pieces. How can we start to join that together? And I think the other thing is then also actually, you know, look at the incentive programs. You know, if a recruiter isn't incentivized to ask those really good questions of a hiring manager of, you know, do you know anybody else in the organization that's hiring? Or, you know, are there any other roles that you guys have got? Then recruiters aren't going to naturally, you know, tend to do that. A lot do because they want to, you know, build that relationship. But really, you know, if your incentive structure aligned to what you're doing, I think, you know, you're saying is exactly true. There's been so much emphasis put on net new, which is part of our methodology, is the cold bit, that actually the incentive structures are all around that, bringing net new business into the organization, and don't necessarily reward, you know, growing accounts as much. So that's looking at the sort of the hot people you've placed with. I think the biggest thing for me in this area is what I call the warm accounts. So they're anyone you've had actions with in the last 12 to 18 months, but maybe not placed. So you've had interviews, you've had, you know, CV sends, you've had a meeting with them, but for some reason or another, you just didn't quite convert them to a client. Again, that's a big pool of organizations that you can then go and speak to, that you've already got that foot in the door with. And it wasn't necessarily because, you know, you didn't work out as a recruitment partner that you didn't make that placement. It could just be that, you know, the candidate didn't get the job, somebody internally filled it, or, you know, all of those things that happen. And actually what you've got is you've got almost this pressure cooker that builds with working for a client that you've got to hear, but you haven't quite converted it. So really looking at that data and pulling it from the CRM, the most effective organizations at this are the ones that they've got somebody in the business, or them as a business leader are doing that legwork for their recruiters. So they're looking at the data and they're chopping it and saying, right, guys, we've identified 100 accounts that we nearly worked with last quarter. Let's put a concerted effort to go after these 100 accounts, how we're going to do it. And starting having that more methodology approach for business development across your organization.
Yeah, I think it's around as well. It's that so many analogies, so little time, but a great leader I used to work with always used to say to me, Lisa, when you get towards the top of the summit, the oxygen does get a bit thinner and it will start to feel a bit tougher, and you will start to feel like your comfort zone, but the reward when you get there is absolutely unbelievable. So by putting that legwork in, you will reach a tipping point with clients where they will be ringing you. And I'm sure you do great business from that. I certainly do. When I look at the work that I've done over the years, the relationships that I build with people have driven my business, and they have grown my business because I've got products that I didn't have 12 years ago that my clients said, I think you're going to be good at this. And I'll be like, really? Yeah. And all of a sudden you go, yeah, they've seen something there. But I also think as well, in the good old days of recruitment where rates were a bit different to what they are now, and recruiters drove very different cars, the only time they potentially managed their accounts and went back to look at lapsed clients or at-risk clients was when they were trying to get over the line from a fees perspective and were trying to find those tricky backdoor placements. So the process would be very simple, where they'd look at candidates that hadn't quite got over the line and clients that hadn't taken a placement, and would just be trying to scrape the final fees in a legal way as opposed to a more homogenous, caring way. But I do think that there's tools on the market now, there's automations on the market that free recruiters up to really get into the muscle and under the skin of their clients and candidates to keep those relationships really strong so they can monetize them. And then it just becomes really natural. And that's really what recruitment is all about, because I think often the recruiters forget the impact that they have on society and the change that they can inflict on businesses in a good way. Right. So I'll get off my soapbox, but I was
just going to say, I just add to that. I think more and more organizations are also looking for like a recruitment partner now. So, we've been growing business over the last 5 years, from 2 of us to now, nearly 70 people. And ideally, if we can have, we do a lot of our recruitment ourselves, not being who we are, but, if we were on that journey and you can actually have, 1 or 2 really trusted partners to be able to help you grow with that, that's so much better than having, 10 recruiters that work different roles across all the organization, because they actually really understand who you are. They sell your culture better. So I think that's really a bit of a shift that people are looking for now is, they're looking for somebody who can really help them, and some of that planning and some of that, more information around, okay, what can we actually support you on? They can support you, going back to the first conversation, they can support you with that data.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll make sure as well we put a link to that lovely toolkit you mentioned within the blog, and we'll market the hell out of that, because that looks like a really decent toolkit to help recruiters with methods for winning business or re-winning, reconverting. When your brand is already warmed up within a client, to make it hot, you might just be 1 degree out.